Okay, so we have now reached the Eurasian landmass. We're going to be talking about Russian expansion between the 15th and the 19th century. And primarily, we're going to be talking about factors facilitating Russian expansion on land. Remember that we've been thus far discussing explorations overseas, so travel across the Atlantic and the Pacific. If you compare the Russian expansion with the Atlantic and Pacific adventures, keep in mind that just as in the pre 1500 world there was land travel, there is continuing land travel here in the Eurasian landmass, and the Russians are planning to go all the way from Moscow, which is in the northwest, to the Pacific coast. So they're essentially traveling eastwards, and this happens ironically at the same time in the same time frame as the American expansion west, and both are trying to reach the Pacific. So keep that at the back of your mind as you look for factors which might help Russia in this landward expansion. Now, keep in mind that Russia has an extensive territory, occupying really nearly one-sixth of the total land area in the world. If you add the square miles, the total area in the United States, in Canada, and in Central America, Russia is actually larger than all three combined. Russia also has the largest taiga or forest area in the world, but we'll come to that in a second as we deal with the soil and vegetation. Now, one of the maps that I have attached deals with climate and vegetation, the geography, and if you were to look at that carefully, you would find that the top layer, it's almost like a four-layer cake. If you were to look at the top, the icing, pardon the pun, you'd be looking at the Arctic zone. And if you look at the layer below, you'd find that it is forest. And the layer below that would be the steppe area with the forest thin out. And this is where you get the rich black soil. It's also the breadbasket area of Russia, providing pretty much the sustenance for 90% of the population. And at the very bottom, the bottommost layer, is the desert with its arid climate, its lack of vegetation. That's also going to create a problem with the steppes, because desert marauders will come into the steppe area to seize crops and products from the breadbasket region of Russia. So soil and vegetation does play an important role in how Russian history would be shaped. It's also, in a way, a factor to consider as Russia moves from west to east. Now, if you look at the Russian landmass, you're actually looking at a dividing line between the west and the east around the Ural Mountains. And the Ural Mountains are not insurmountable. It's not like they can't be crossed. But west of that is European Russia. East of that is Asiatic Russia. The concentration primarily in terms of empire building was in the west, with Moscow as the capital, and Moscow was in the forest region. Moscow was chosen over and above the original capital prior to our starting point in the 1450-1500 period. Prior to the start of the modern period, the capital was Kiev, and Kiev was in Ukraine, and Ukraine would be in the steppe area in the four-layer vegetation that we just talked about. And so because of the self-sufficiency in food, as a matter of fact, the excess which could feed surrounding areas, both the taiga forest area north of it and the desert area south of it, the steppe region had a predominant influence in Russian history. It was also open to attack. Unlike the forest area where you could hide your resources, where you could actually provide a natural camouflage for both people personnel and goods. In the steppe area, you're wide open and visible and wide open to attack. And so the moving of the capital also was for strategic reasons further north into the taiga region or the forest region. But even though if you look at layers of vegetation to be different as you go from west to east, whether you're going 3,000 miles or 5,000 miles to reach the Pacific, from Moscow to, say, Vladivostok on the east coast, the actual terrain would be the same. So even if they traveled across miles and miles of inhospitable region or miles and miles of the forest area, they are crossing into unknown territory, but they're also not combating an unfamiliar climate and terrain. So that was another reason why the Russian expansion, even though it covered so many thousands of miles, was successful. Add also the factor of the river systems. Now, Russia, both in the east and in the west, had a lot of navigable rivers. In the west, they included rivers like the Dnieper, the Dniester, the Volga, and a lot of trade centers, small trade centers, had developed as exchange points, as market centers. They never really developed into urban settings until much, much later. In the 1450-1500 period, there were a few of these trading centers, but primarily Russia was an agrarian society. But the rivers helped in terms of transporting goods and people. In the east, as you look at rivers like the Ob, Lena, Yenisei, and Amur, Ob, Lena, and Yenisei would be from west to east, reaching up to the Pacific. Amur, slightly south of it, as a border area between Russia and China. Again, there are two maps provided. If you take a look or if you go do a Google search online, you'll find geographical as well as political maps for all regions, and certainly that of Russia. And you'll find that Russian rivers, as they flowed into the Pacific, they would make the journey on foot easier. At the narrowest point, where there is a short margin between the two rivers, that's where they would try to cross over on land. Otherwise, they could use the rivers because these were unencumbered by rapids. They were not like the rivers that we would discuss in Africa, where it would be very hard to navigate these rivers. So as they move from the western to the eastern side, from European to Asiatic Russia, they made use of these extensive riverways, and at the point where the two rivers were closest, they would actually walk east as little as possible, use the land, and then go back and use the river and go further southeast if necessary. And in this manner, they were able to reach the Pacific much faster than their American counterparts. The American westward movement took much longer to finish than the Russian. The Russians were actually on the Pacific coast by about the mid-17th century. Find that the first flag was planted in Vladivostok in 1645, and voila, they'd reached the Pacific. This was much earlier than the American westward movement. By that time, the crossing of all frontiers had not taken place. Resources, well, the human resources that we look at in terms of what facilitated Russian advance into the Pacific, these are adventurers, just your average, fortune seekers, people who want to experience a new land, make a new beginning, a fresh start, just as you had people in the westward movement in the American context. In Russia, there were also political prisoners who didn't have a future, whose only option to be free was to go away from where they were incarcerated, and if they were given an option to be free, they would choose unknown territory, crossing into unknown territory for 3,000 to 5,000 miles over being behind bars. serfs. Russia was primarily an agrarian system, so they didn't really have the chance to escape into cities, urban areas, and start a whole new existence. And rather than be limited in their mobility and be restricted to the land and being owned by their landowners and be obligated to them, Russian serfs, if given a choice, would opt to go further east across the Asiatic Russian landmass and reach the Pacific. So oftentimes they were recruited because these people saw there was no future in staying on where they were. Often they voluntarily offered to go further east because that was the only way to climb upwards socially. And oftentimes these were people who were just thrill seekers, adventure lovers who wanted to experience a new beginning, a new sense of freedom, a new achievement. There were also ethnic tensions built in, and again, the people who were chosen to represent the Russian advance east oftentimes had a love-hate relationship with the center. Russians were divided into a number of ethnic groups. Just to make this really simple, we're not going to go into all the statistics, but if you were to divide up the different minorities in Russia and the majority group, who were the Russians and the Belarusians, you'd be looking at a 52-48 split. 52% Russians, Belarusians, and 48% other ethnic minorities, of which the Kazakhs were more or less your frontiersmen types, were used to hardship. There were nomadic groups. They were accustomed to traveling on horseback, and they were often chosen to represent this the eastward movement for Russia to move towards the Pacific, because it was believed that they could sustain, for long periods, hardship as they traveled east to the Pacific. In terms of material resources, they were provided with arms and ammunition. The Russian government was able to procure arms and ammunition, as on the western side they were in contact with empires close to them, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Prussian Empire, eventually the German Empire. Trading of items, they were primarily concerned with the fur trade. They realized there was enough profit to be made from different kinds of fur that was available in the Siberian plains, in Asiatic Russia, and so this would actually account for 30% of their income. So there was an incentive as you move into Roman numeral 3, from geographical factors to resources to incentives. This was a motive that kept the Russian government going and provided them with a desire to sponsor these adventure seekers, people who were looking for an upward social mobility, Kazakhs who were recruited because they were of the hardy variety. And if there was profit to be made and these people were willing to provide them with that profit, then it was a win-win combination. And the profit came from fur, a variety of fur, ermine, sable, lots of different varieties that provided them with an extra income, as I said, about 30% of the national income. Tea would be a product that Russians would be introduced to once they used the river system of the Amur River. As they went further and further east, gold and fur was to be found, and gold and fur were wonderful in terms of profit, but gold and fur didn't feed you. So they looked towards not the sparsely populated Siberian plains, but further southeast towards China, which during the Ming Empire was flourishing and certainly could provide them with items of food and goods that they could trade in. In certain periods of the Ming Empire, this was far more possible than others, and where in certain Ming dynastic periods the trade was not welcome, then the Russians and the Ming Empire actually came into conflict. Oftentimes borders were drawn on the Albazin River and the Amur River, Albazin port and the Amur River, where select products were exchanged, or the Russians were allowed to reside for short periods of time to trade in specific goods. So a variety of incentives that made it possible for the Russians to go further east. And as they went further and further east, they realized that, very much like the ocean-going ventures that started out as single ventures, as sporadic ventures, that if there's continuing profit to be made, then it made sense to settle down. So the colonization would begin, but at a much, much slower pace later on. But the adventure seekers would already pave the way for such colonization of the future. The directions that they traveled in Roman numeral 4, we've already explained that they went northeast and southeast to the Pacific, and they went through Siberia, reaching the Sea of Okhotsk. They would go a little further southeast through Ukraine and use the resources of the breadbasket of the steppe area. But as they went further and further away to the east, then more food was needed in their quest for gold and fur. And so China was an objective. And the Treaty of Nerchinsk finally established the boundaries between Russia and China. No longer were these volatile or fluctuating, because that would result in an interruption of trade and conflict in which resources were frittered away. And the Russians were very focused on what they wanted to achieve from their movement eastwards. As you look at individuals who are responsible under Roman numeral 5, you'll find that Ivan III and Ivan IV were instrumental in the first phase of the expansion, as they used these new fortune seekers as a counterpoise to the old rivals, the boyars, the Russian nobility. As in the West, so also in Eastern Europe, there's going to be always dynastic rivalry, there's going to be family squabbles, aristocrats fighting with aristocrats, and everybody has their eye on the throne. And so in order to provide a balance, they would seek new allies, and they sought the middle class, the gentry, the people who were trying to move upwards socially to help them. Initially, as they resisted Tatar or Mongol control, they had been used to building state power, taking the title of Tsar under Ivan III, conquering little urban centers like Novgorod, which provide them with an extra income, an extra dimension of income added to their agrarian resources. Eventually, the capital would be chosen as Moscow. As you know, they moved from the steppe region to the taiga or forest region, and all of this is happening before the Romanov dynasty, with which you're probably more familiar, people like the Tsar Nicholas and Catherine, they belong to the Romanov dynasty. Prior to that, you had Ivan III and Ivan IV. Now, Ivan IV, although he was known as Ivan the Terrible and notorious for cruelty, including to his own family members, even his son, whose death he was personally responsible for because he hadn't towed the political line, as it were. And so this is a man you really did not associate with, kindness and empathy and a lot of consideration. He was instrumental in the takeover of Kazan and Astrakhan. These are remaining Mongol holdings which had a loyalty to Islam because they had been converted into Islam. Now keep in mind the border between Russian south and China's north. There's going to be a lot of gray area in terms of different religions, religious influences like Lamaism, like Islam. And so this is a region, as Russia is moving further and further east in its eastward expansion to the Pacific, they're trying to take over control of areas which seem to have a loyalty towards an outside authority. And Kazan and Astrakhan would fall into that category. There was one other area which is featured very prominently in the news in recent times, and that was the Crimean Peninsula, which was not only was converted, had converted to Islam, but it was also directly incorporated into the Ottoman Empire, and so it had a loyalty to the Ottoman Empire. It was supported by militarily and with other resources by the Ottoman Sultan. So taking over of Crimea would take much, much longer than Kazan and Astrakhan. Initially, they would go through these territories, think that they have conquered them, and once the Russian soldiers had moved away, Kazan and Astrakhan would continue to behave as though they were completely independent. So they would be surrounded by garrisons, and personnel would be stationed there to drive home the point that they were under Russian control. When military strategy alone wasn't enough, then they would use empire builders, people like Stroganov and Yermak. Stroganov was responsible for the southeastern conquest. Yermak actually was responsible for the conquest of Siberia. Now, these are people who are also adventure seekers. Yermak, as a matter of fact, was running from the law, and he was known as a river pirate who had a lot of other river pirates at his beck and call, and so the state gave up trying to hunt him down and thought instead that they could make an alliance with him and use his influence amongst other river pirates to make sure that their products, as they were being shipped across the Volga, were not marauded upon. And it is people like Yermak who would show that they had the mentality of a Cortez, a Hernan Cortez, or a Pizarro in terms of the conquest of Siberia and building up a Russian empire in Siberia. These are people who are also instrumental in driving home the point that this is an extension of the Russian territory, and so a uniformity of life and assimilation was expected. Diplomatic missions were sent to Europe to prove the point that the Russians had not only advanced territorially, but they had expanded in terms of building an empire. They had now the resources from the fur and the gold to make architectural improvements, innovations, like, for example, building a new capital, the capital at St. Petersburg, which Russia felt was equivalent to the palace at Versailles, the showpiece of France under Louis XIV. By this time, the rule of the Ivans is over, and Russia has entered a period of chaos, the time of troubles, as it was called, because there's really no an overall authority inside which was going to be obeyed by all the different groups. And then the Romanov dynasty takes over control. At first, the first Romanov ruler, Mikhail, is chosen because he's 17, and the Russian nobility, the boyars, feel that they can manipulate him and really twist him around their little finger, make him do everything that they wanted, and so they select Mikhail. But Mikhail doesn't remain 17 for the rest of his life, and so he learns to assert himself. The Russian boyars are clearly rethinking their selection. By the time you come to the second Romanov, Alexis Romanov, there is no doubt who was running the show. It's not the Russian boyars, but the emperor. And the emperor has been very successful in securing control over Siberia and going clear across the Pacific coast to Okhotsk, reaching Okhotsk on the east coast, on the Pacific coast. He's also trying to assert authority over the Russian Orthodox Church, which has, from the 4th century and certainly by the 10th century, developed a lot of conflicts with the Catholic world, with Western Europe. There are a lot of class and ethnic issues. The class issues stem from the continuation of serfdom. Ethnic issues, the minority with the majority population, the different minorities, ethnic rivalry between and amongst these minorities, and the conflict with the majority power, that is the Russian Romanov dynasty. Oftentimes, these ethnic and class issues were combined, as in the case of one peasant/Kazakh rebellion, where Stenka Razin in the 17th century raises a red flag, as it were, and this conflict becomes a year-long conflict which is brutally put down. And if this is any prelude to what's going to happen in the 18th century and beyond, well, clearly the signs are there. In the 18th century, we'll come across another rebellion that was far more violent than the Stenka Razin rebellion of the 17th century. We're not going to do a ball-by-ball description of the Romanov dynasty. Moving to Peter the Great, who was perhaps the first modernizer in the Russian Romanov dynasty. He's the one who recognizes the importance of a navy and realizes that if he has to compete as a world power, then not only is it important to expand in terms of land acquisition and resources on land, but also to be in command of the ocean. And as Russia's access to the ocean was going to be either through the Baltic in the north or through the Black Sea to the Mediterranean and thereafter to the Atlantic, Peter decided to modernize the navy and place a great deal of emphasis on building and equipping and training the navy. So this two-pronged attack to the north in the Baltic and the Black Sea resulted, first of all, in the realization that the Baltic is going to be snowbound pretty much 6 months of the year. So the primary focus shifted to the Black Sea area and to retaining control of the Mediterranean through the Straits of the Dardanelles. And he was also making St. Petersburg a showpiece, like the Palace of Versailles, building a capital, a palace, at tremendous cost to the population and to his treasury. He's also completing the colonization of Siberia that has begun under Alexis, but Alexis was primarily responsible for securing Siberia, not populating it to the point that Peter the Great would be successful. He's also responsible for not only conquering but retaining control over Ukraine and thus expanding the Russian territory extensively under his rule, and also moving towards the Amur River, towards the China border, and eventually setting a boundary between Russia and China. Fast forward to Catherine the Great in the 18th century, who was one of the enlightened absolutist rulers. We briefly discussed what enlightened absolutism was in the 17th and 18th century isms that we talked about. And Catherine falls into the category where she was influenced by the Enlightenment, but not to the extent that she would erase serfdom or give all people complete equality. Persecution of serfs continued under Catherine, even though at the beginning of her reign it seemed like she was going to institute legal reforms through instruction. The projected legal changes included equality before the law, right type of punishment for the right crime, very noble thoughts, but eventually she was going to backtrack and go for a much more conservative policy, protecting the privileges of the nobility, the boyars, by issuing a charter of the nobility, primarily because there was a rebellion that shook the regime to its foundation. And this was staged by Emelian Pugachev, who was at once a peasant protesting against the corrupt serfdom institution and their nobility, the Russian boyars who exploited them, as also the minority-majority issue. And so, again, like Stenka Razin's rebellion in the previous century, peasant Kazakh rebellion that was staged under Pugachev could have been very detrimental to the stability of the Russian Empire. This was a violent protest for 1 year. Emelian Pugachev actually issued a manifesto that freed the serfs, and Catherine responded by making a public spectacle of the assassination of Emelian Pugachev in St. Petersburg. And some argue that it was done in St. Petersburg as a demonstration of this new beginning, new authority, perhaps also to spare the pristineness of Moscow. Under Catherine, there would also be the completion of Russian expansion towards the east with the conquest of Crimea. Crimea was a target for the last 2 centuries, and there were sporadic attempts to take over Crimea, the last of which succeeded by a set of two sets of wars that were conducted by General Suvorov. And General Suvorov had the same medal as a general that he would associate with people like Napoleon. So Catherine was very fortunate in having the resources of General Suvorov in the conquest of Crimea. And part of this Crimean conquest was also possible because Catherine had made some diplomatic overtures towards neighboring Austria and Prussia, both of whom were interested in expanding in the same region. And Frederick the Great of Prussia and Joseph of Austria, both of whom we have discussed briefly as enlightened absolutists who were actually moved by some of the ideas of the Enlightenment. And while Frederick made some token attempts to translate theory into practice and achieve total equality, Joseph actually was instrumental in bringing a lot of changes. In fact, he could be called truly an enlightened ruler, more of an enlightened ruler and less of an absolutist. So, with the cooperation of Joseph and Prussia, of Austria and Frederick the Great of Prussia, who both decided to keep their hands off of Crimea, while Russia advanced into Crimea and took over with the help of General Suvorov and formalized that conquest with the Treaty of Jaffe and the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca, so that the Ottoman Turkish Empire no longer had Crimea as an incorporated part of their empire, but it was actually now a part of the Russian Empire. And this is also the time that trade agreements were finalized with the Ming Empire and borders were finally set with the Stanovoy Mountains and the Amur River as a boundary line between Russia and China. We may be able to include 2 video excerpts, The Making of Russia, 1450 to 1860, and Russia, a personal history, a short segment of which I will try and upload once the captions are ready. And it might be helpful to look at these videos as you look through your text, you look through your primary sources in the human record, and as you follow the lecture outline and the discussion we've just had, and have a comprehensive picture of the Russian advancement from 1450 to about 1800.